my pleasure to introduce to you our first speaker in this course on Latin American migration and global context. This week, we're going to have Professor Lilia Fernandez, professor at the Department of History of The Ohio State University. She is an expert on transnational migration and particularly on Latin American migration to the U.S. She is going to be talking to us about U.S. immigration policies over the 20th century and Latin American immigration. I hope you will enjoy her talk.
Hello, I'm Professor Lilia Fernandez from the Department of History at The Ohio State University. Today we're going to review 20th century U.S. immigration policies and their impact on Latin American immigration. Unit 1, Introduction and Past Immigration. We often imagine the United States as a nation of immigrants, quote unquote, and when we conjure up that idea, we generally have a particular image in mind. It's usually immigrants from Europe coming through Ellis Island in the late 19th or early 20th centuries. When we discuss contemporary immigration in the 21st century, however, we generally think of people coming from Latin America, although there are also immigrants from Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Europe, of course. But the image in the popular imagination is usually that of a Latin American immigrant, and often a Mexican immigrant. And we consider them to be both new to the United States and different from immigrants of the past. In particular, we tend to focus on the legal status of immigrants today. So how is immigration new and different today than in the past? How have our policies changed over the past century? What helps to explain the phenomenon of undocumented or illegal immigration in the United States, and does it all really come from Latin America? So the main question we'll be considering for this course is, what have our immigration policies been over the 20th century, and how has this shaped Latin American immigration to the United States? Quite simply, what I hope you will see by the end of this lecture is that U.S. immigration policies over the 20th century have made it more difficult for immigrants from Latin America to migrate legally, at the same time that we have recruited such labor and there has been a greater immigration demand from these countries in the second half of the 20th century. So let's begin by looking at immigration to the United States historically to get an understanding and has not changed over the course of the 20th century. And we can start with the American immigration narrative. Remember that in the early part of American history, the majority of immigrants came from Northern and Western Europe from the 17th through the mid-19th century. This was considered the first wave of immigrants. By the late 19th century, we saw a new wave, what we may call the Ellis Island immigrants. And this is usually the period and migration wave that most Americans think of when they talk about immigration in the past. It's often a very romanticized and nostalgic view that overlooks a much harsher reality history. So this wave was considered to be new immigrants because they were coming from different origins, Southern and Eastern Europe, in the years of 1880 to 1924. Altogether, approximately 27 million immigrants came to the United States during the years of 1880 to 1930. And this was a period of the greatest immigration to the country until then. So here's our first quiz question. When immigrants arrived in the U.S. before World War I, which document was required for them to enter legally? Was it A, a valid passport, B, a U.S. work permit, C, a certified identification card, or D, none of the above? The answer is none of the above. With the exception of Asian immigrants whom we had barred in 1882 and 1907, we accepted just about anyone who could make their way to American shores. Only about 2% of immigrants were denied entry at Ellis Island. So in other words, almost everybody was legal. Anyone who made it to U.S. shores was generally going to be admitted to the United States. Our borders were fairly open at this time. So how many immigrants came in these decades? From 1880 to 1890, approximately 5.2 million people entered the United States. From 1890 to 1900, about 4.2 million. And from 1901 to 1920, 14.4 million. Altogether, in these 4 decades, from 1880 to 1920, approximately 24 million immigrants entered the United States. Now, as a point of comparison, we can look at a similar time period of nearly 4 decades from 1960 to 1996, when approximately 21 million immigrants came to the U.S. We can see in this table from the Cato Institute what immigration figures look like decade by decade from 1820 to 2003, and notice the trends in immigration numbers to the country. So why did immigrants come in these years? Many of them came through the process of chain migration to join family members who had migrated earlier. Most had been displaced in some way by industrialization in Europe and had lost their livelihoods as farmers or craftsmen and women. Most of them were in search of economic opportunities, and some were even escaping natural disasters, for example, like one group of refugees who were fleeing from an earthquake in Italy. And others were fleeing civil wars, pogroms, and persecution in the case of Russian Jews, and other forms of violence. So how were immigrants received by native-born Americans and earlier immigrants? We tend to forget that this wave of Southern and Eastern Europeans were not very welcome by most Americans, and the negative attitudes and concerns about immigrants today resembled those about these immigrants in the past. So let's look at this quote. Immigration to this country is making its greatest relative increase from races most alien to the body of the American people, and from the lowest and most illiterate classes among those races. They represent the rudest form of labor, reduce the rate of wages by ruinous competition. These are people whom it is very difficult to assimilate and who do not promise well for the standard of civilization in the United States. Now, this might ring familiar today as something that anti-immigrant or nativist advocates might argue about immigrants coming to the U.S. in the 21st century. But it actually comes from a member of the House of Representatives, Congressman Henry Cabot Lodge, in the 1890s, referring to Italians, Poles, Russians, and Hungarians. We have to remember, native-born Northern and Western European Americans did not think these new European immigrants were similar. They didn't even think they were the same race. It was not until the era of World War II that many Southern and Eastern European immigrants and their children became accepted as Americans and as white by older generations of native-born Americans. Throughout the early 20th century, some Americans expressed concerns and views against immigrants that would sound familiar today. Arguments such as, immigrants take our jobs, they are an economic burden for the country, they don't pay taxes, they get on welfare. And so we have this quote from a newspaper in 1908, which noted that, quote, out of 700,000 immigrants arriving in 1907, 420,000 of them were unskilled workers, and 160,000 were women and children with no occupations. About 30 aliens out of every 10,000 became objects of charity, compared with 9 out of 10,000 native-born citizens. This is from the New York World in 1908. The overwhelming majority of immigrants came to work, of course, and they provided critical labor in an age of industrialization and mass consumerism. They worked running the steel mills that made modern industrial life possible, working in packing and processing meat, in agriculture, harvesting our food, and mass-producing clothing in the nation's sweatshops. Still, some blamed them for disease, crime, or charged that they were unwilling to assimilate, brought foreign culture, language, and customs, like this elected official from Seattle who noted, quote, few people really understand that unrestricted immigration from Europe for 10 years would change the entire living standards and ideals of our people. And this was from Ole Hansen, former mayor of Seattle, quoted in the Chicago Daily News in 1921. Nativism has had a long history in the U.S. It's not just a new phenomena that emerged with the migration of Latin Americans. Placing contemporary nativism in its historical perhaps make us more skeptical about the alarmist claims that immigrants are ruining the nation, that they will destroy American civilization. Some Americans feared the same thing in the past about the Irish, the Italians, Poles, and Jews, and those fears did not bear out. These immigrants did not spell disaster for the United States. The fears that they would not assimilate, that they were criminally inclined, and other denigrating characterizations did not hold true in the long run. On the contrary, they assimilated to American society, but they also changed and enriched our culture, just as immigrants continue to do today. One key difference between immigrants of the past and those today, however, is the legal status of many. And as we'll see in our next unit, it became increasingly more difficult to immigrate legally to the United States over the 20th century as our immigration policies became more restrictive.